I have started the recording. I have remembered to start the recording. I have brought with me some caffeine because I do not have to wake up early tomorrow. My class is canceled. Hello. So we're gonna power through this with a code red. Oh god. I don't have to pee 800 million times because that's what caffeine does to me. Hi. Hello. Um, I don't have any. I'm not gonna be super intimidated. I will be listening the whole tome. Yep. 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 You told me about that. You're good. Let's see. I haven't put on any ambience yet. I wanted to know if there was any that you guys preferred. I thought you were involved. What do you mean by that? Uh, in the meantime, I wanted to ask, like, we could do more snowstorm. We could do nothing. We could do like a crackling fire. Oh, involved with no. Cred has not read this book. Cred is involved in some books down the line, but not this one. Some future projects, but not this current project. Big fan of Rain. We could do Rain. I'm cool with Rain. Pen Pal, Art of War. There's like four others. There's that wasn't even neither of those originally we planned was All Tomorrows. There was also Night. There's a bunch of them that Cred wants to do. Or the Pokemon guidebook. Wait, I might have that. I'm not gonna get distracted. I've already started the recording. I'm eating up hard drive space. The current vote is for Rain. Does anybody have any? I'm just gonna start looking it up. So, if you have something you would prefer to that, Rain is good. Okay. We could do like, what do you want to do? Like open window rain, uh, tent rain, car rain. What are we feeling? I like the car rain. Thunderstorms. Okay, that's probably pretty good for this. Dark and stormy. Okay, yeah, that'd be good. How's that? Too loud, too quiet? I got it pretty quiet, obviously. It's ambience. You don't want it to be too loud, but if you need it to be up a little bit, let me know. Up. How's this? Good. Nice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. The book that we're starting tonight is called The King in Yellow. It is by Robert W. Chambers. It was published, I believe, in the year 1895. That's off the top of my head, so give or take a couple years. Definitely was right up against the turn of the century. Originally, The King in Yellow was sort of published in a huge, like, just tome of his short stories. Like, it was the four short stories that comprise The King in Yellow, and then it's like eight more that don't have anything to do with The King in Yellow. Like, he just published a bunch of his work in one big short story book. And I've read that, and I can confidently say that there's no point to doing it. So, we're going to read the four canon ones through the course of this book group, and we're not going to worry about the non-canon ones. Some of them are pretty good, but they're not horror themed at all. Like, they're not super interesting. But he's got nice prose, so they're kind of fun. Um, Robert W. Chambers is one of the biggest inspirations that Lovecraft cited. Um, they, I believe, I don't know, I believe they wrote back and forth a little bit when Lovecraft was first getting into it, and some of his works are explicitly based off of the stuff that happens in this book. So that's kind of cool. As far as content, there's not really a lot to worry about. There is a little bit of uh, there's a little bit of racism in it that I think it's literally like over in the first few pages. So we'll have to deal with that tonight, and then we won't have to deal with it again, from what I remember. There's as far as horror, there's not really anything graphic. I think we should be fine. This is a pretty tame book, in my opinion. There's no essay. There's no like excessive gore. Really nothing to worry about, in my opinion. Being a little bit of an older book, the prose is not as crisp and clear and easily, translated as Stephen King's book was. So if at any point you guys are not sure what you just heard or you have a question, please stop me. I mean, I'm trying to do like a no man left behind policy when it comes to these books. Like I would rather you stop me. And then if it's a big thing where you think you might need to go back and check the recording, like you missed a huge 20 minutes or something, you know, I can remind you to do that. But if everybody's settled in and comfortable and everybody's ready to start, then I will start. How are we feeling? I'm gonna take that to mean good. Shoutouts to our bots today, Boss Undy and Sin. I don't know. That's a Russian name that I can't pronounce. I guess if nobody has any objections, then we'll get right into it. My throat's a little scratchy today. The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. Part 1, The Repairer of Reputations. Toward the end of the year 1920, the government of the United States had practically completed the program adopted during the last months of President Winthrop's administration. The country was apparently tranquil. Everyone knows how the tariff and labor questions were settled. The war with Germany, incident on that country's seizure of the Samoan Islands, had left no visible scars upon the Republic, and the temporary occupation of Norfolk by the invading army had been forgotten in the joy over repeated naval victories, and the subsequent ridiculous plight of General von Gartenlaub's forces in the state of New Jersey. The Cuban and Hawaiian investments had paid 100%, and the territory of Samoa was well worth its cost as a coaling station. The country was in a superb state of defense. Every coast city had been well supplied with land fortifications. The army, under the parental eye of General Staff, organized according to the Prussian system, had been increased to 300,000 men, with a territorial reserve of 1,000,000, and 6 magnificent squadrons of cruisers and battleships patrolled the 6 stations of the navigable seas. Oh, let me do my transition. Leaving a steam reserve amply fitted to control home waters. The gentlemen from the West had at last been constrained to acknowledge that a college for the training of diplomats was as necessary as law schools are for the training of barristers, and consequently we were no longer represented abroad by incompetent patriots. The nation was prosperous. Chicago, for a moment paralyzed after a second great fire, had risen from its ruins, white and imperial, and more beautiful than the white city which had been built for its plaything in 1893. Everywhere good architecture was replacing bad, and even in New York a sudden craving for decency had swept away a great portion of the existing horrors. Streets had been widened, properly paved and lighted, trees had been planted, squares laid out, elevated structures demolished, and underground roads built to replace them. The new government buildings and barracks were fine bits of architecture. The long system of stone quays which completely surrounded the island had been turned into parks, which proved a godsend to the population. A subsidizing of the State Theater and State Opera brought its own reward. The United States National Academy of Design was much like the European institutions of the same kind. Nobody envied the Secretary of Fine Arts, neither his cabinet position or his portfolio. The Secretary of Forestry and Game Preservation had a much easier time, thanks to the new system of National Mounted Police. We had profited well by the latest treaties with France and England, the exclusion of foreign-born Jews as a measure of self-preservation, the settlement of the new independent Negro state of Suwannee, the checking of immigration, the new laws concerning naturalization, and the gradual centralization of power in the executive all contributed to national common prosperity. When the government solved the Indian problem and squadrons of Indian cavalry scouts in native costume were substituted for the pitiable organizations tacked onto the tail of skeletonized regiments by a former Secretary of War, the nation drew a long sigh of relief. When, after the colossal Congress of Religions, bigotry and intolerance were laid in their graves and kindness and charity began to draw warring sects together, many thought the millennium had arrived, at least in the New World, which after all is a world by itself. Oh yes, the Indian problem. Yeah, don't worry, we'll talk about that. We're going to discuss that. Don't worry. I'm not burying it at all. Trust me. But self-preservation is the first law, and the United States had to look on in helpless sorrow as Germany, Italy, Spain, and Belgium were writhed in the throes of anarchy, while Russia, watching by from the Caucasus, stooped and bound them one by one. Don't worry, don't worry. I'm not saying don't reflect on it, but don't worry. We have plenty. We will address it. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. In the city of New York in the summer of 1899 was signalized by the dismantling of the elevated railroads. The summer of 1900 will live in the memories of New York people for many a cycle. The Dodge statue was removed in that year. In the following winter began the agitation for the repeal of the laws prohibiting suicide, which bore its final fruit in the month of April 1920, when the first government lethal chamber was opened on Washington Square. I had walked down that day from Dr. Archer's house on Madison Avenue, where I had been as a mere formality. Ever since that fall from my horse 4 years before, I had been troubled at times with pains in the back of my head and neck, but now for months they had been absent, and the doctor sent me away that day saying there was nothing more to be cured in me. It was hardly worth his fee to be told that, I knew it myself. Still, I did not grudge him the money. What I minded was the mistake which he had made at first. When they picked me up from the pavement where I lay unconscious, and somebody had mercifully sent a bullet through my horse's head, I was carried to Dr. Archer, and he, pronouncing my brain affected, placed me in his private asylum, where I was obliged to endure treatment for insanity. At last he decided that I was well, and I, knowing that my mind had always been as sound as his, if not sounder, paid my tuition, as he jokingly called it, and left. I told him, smiling, that I would get even with him for this mistake, and he laughed heartily and asked me to call once in a while. I did so, hoping for a chance to even up accounts, but he gave me none, and told him I could wait. And I told him I could wait. The fall from my horse fortunately left no evil results. On the contrary, it had changed my whole character for the better. From a lazy young man about town, I had become active, energetic, temperate, and above all else, ambitious. There was only one thing which troubled me. I laughed at my own uneasiness, and yet it troubled me. During my convalescence, I had bought and read for the first time The King in Yellow. I remember finishing the first act, and that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck with barred grate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it, but as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, perhaps it was of joy so poignant that I suffered it in every nerve, I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept, shaking, to my bedroom, where I read and reread it, and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. This is the thing that troubles me, for I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, where the twin suns sink into the lake of Hali, and my mind will bear forever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer, as the writer has cursed this world with this beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth, a world which now trembles before the King in Yellow. When the French government seized the translated copies which had just arrived in Paris, London, of course, became eager to read it. It is well known how the book spread like an infectious disease, from city to city, from continent to continent, barred out here, confiscated there, denounced by press and pulpit, censored by even the most advanced of literary anarchists. No definite principles had been violated in those wicked pages, no doctrine promulgated, no convictions outraged. It could not be judged in any known standard yet, although it was acknowledged that the supreme note of art had been struck in The King in Yellow. All felt that human nature could not bear the strain, nor thrive on words which the essence of purest poison lurked. In which the essence of purest poison lurked. The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterward with more awful effect. It was, I remember, the 13th day of April, 1920, that the first government lethal chamber was established on the south side of Washington Square, between Worcester Street and South Fifth Avenue. The block, which had formerly consisted of a lot of shabby old buildings used as cafes and restaurants for foreigners, had been acquired by the government in the winter of 1898. The French and Italian cafes and restaurants were torn down. The whole block was enclosed by a gilded iron railing and converted into a lovely garden with lawns, flowers, and fountains. In the center of the garden stood a small white building, severely classical in architecture and surrounded by thickets of flowers. 6 Ionic columns supported the roof, and the single door was of bronze. A splendid marble group of the Fates stood before the door, the work of a young American sculptor, Boris Yvain, who had died in Paris when only 23 years old. The inauguration ceremonies were in progress as I crossed University Place and entered the square. I threaded my way through the silent throng of spectators, but was stopped at 4th Street by a cordon of police. A regiment of the United States Lancers were drawn up in a hollow square around the lethal chamber. On a raised tribune facing Washington Park stood the governor of New York, and behind him were grouped the mayor of New York and Brooklyn, the inspector general of police, the commandant of state troops, Colonel Livingston, military aide to the president of the United States, General Blount, commanding at the governor's island, Major General Hamilton, commanding the garrison of New York and Brooklyn, Admiral Buffy of the fleet in the North River, Surgeon General Lansford, the staff of the National Free Hospital, Senators Wise and Franklin of New York, and the Commissioner of Public Works. The tribune was surrounded by a squadron of hussars from the National Guard. The governor was finishing his reply to the short speech of the Surgeon General. I heard him say, "The laws prohibiting suicide and providing punishment for any attempt at self-destruction have been repealed. The government has seen fit to acknowledge the right of man to end an existence which may have become intolerable to him, through physical suffering or mental despair. It is believed that the community will be benefited by the removal of such people from their midst. Since the passage of this law, the number of suicides in the United States has not increased. Now the government is determined to establish a lethal chamber in every city, town, and village in the country. It remains to be seen whether or not the class of human creatures from whose desponding ranks new victims of self-destruction fall daily will accept the relief thus provided." He paused and turned to the white lethal chamber. The silence in the street was absolute. "There a painless death awaits him who can no longer bear the sorrows of his life. If death is welcome, let him seek it there." Then, quickly turning to the military aide of the president's household, he said, "I declare the lethal chamber open." And again, facing the vast crowd, he cried in a clear voice, "Citizens of New York and of the United States of America, through me the government declares the lethal chamber to be open." The solemn hush was broken by a sharp cry of command. The squadron of hussars filed after the governor's carriage. The lancers wheeled and formed along Fifth Avenue to wait for the commandant of the garrison, and the mounted police followed them. I left the crowd to gape and stare at the white marble death chamber, and, crossing South Fifth Avenue, walked along the western side of that thoroughfare to Bleecker Street. Then I turned to the right and stopped before a dingy shop which bore the sign, "Hawberk, Armorer." I glanced in the doorway and saw Hawberk busy in his little shop at the end of the hall. He looked up and, catching sight of me, cried in his deep-hearted voice, "Come in, Mr. Castaigne." Constance, his daughter, rose to meet me as I crossed the threshold and held out her pretty hand, but I saw the blush of disappointment on her cheeks and knew that it was another Castaigne she had expected, my cousin Louis. I smiled at her confusion, complimented her on the banner she was embroidering from a colored plate. I hate this guy's name, Hawberk. Give me 1 second. So, let's take a minute because already we have had a fucking wild ride up to this point. Already a lot has happened. That was a lot. So, to recap, let's talk about this. So, we started with a vision of what the narrator imagines, what the narrator's future is like. What the author imagines the future will be like. What the narrator's future is like. It's now 1920. As a reminder, this book was published in the 1890s, so he's making it up. He made up a President Winthrop. He made up a war with Germany that turned out to be pretty prophetic, but I guess even back then they probably saw it coming. Um, and then he talks about all the different things that's happened in America. They've deported Jewish people. They've relocated black people to another country. They've solved the Indian problem, and they've established they've eliminated all bigotry and intolerance, according to Castaigne. Too loud, isn't it? Nice. Cool. And they've eliminated all bigotry and intolerance, as he says, and they've established suicide chambers where you can, by moving it someplace else. Yeah, right. They've established suicide chambers where you can just walk up and die. And the guy who, what was it, the mayor or the governor, who gave his speech about seemed pretty resentful of people who are suicidal. He was like, "Yeah, we're better off without you, so just go in here." The narrator said that he had fallen off of a horse and injured his head, or that he had fallen off a horse and had to be taken to the hospital, and the doctors told him he injured his head, but he did not injure his head. They were mistaken, he said. And while he was in there, he read The King in Yellow, which was a book that apparently is banned all over the world, and that he has some very strong feelings about. And then he was released, and his name is Mr. Castaigne, and that's what we're up to so far. So he's going on a walk. He just witnessed the opening of the lethal chamber, and now he's stopping by his friend Hallberg's house, his friend Hallberg's business, to greet him. Does that make sense to everybody? It's a mile a minute opening, but we're gonna return to a normal pace from here. Old Hallberg sat riveting the worn greaves of some ancient suit of armor, and the ting, ting, ting of his little hammer sounded pleasantly in the quaint shop. Presently he dropped his hammer and fussed about for a moment with a tiny wrench. The soft clash of the mail sent a thrill of pleasure through me. I loved to hear the music of steel brushing against steel, the mellow shock of the mallet on thigh pieces, the jingle of the chain armor. That was the only reason I went to see Hallberg. He had never interested me personally, nor did Constance, except for the fact of her being in love with Louis. This did occupy my attention, and sometimes even kept me awake at night. But I knew in my heart that all would come right, and that I should arrange for the future as I expected to arrange that of my kind doctor, John Archer. However, I should never have troubled myself about visiting them just then, had it not been, as I say, that the music of the tinkling hammer had for me this strong fascination. I would sit for hours listening and listening, and when a stray sunbeam struck the inlaid steel, the sensation it gave me was almost too keen to endure. My eyes would become fixed, dilating with the pleasure that stretched every nerve almost to breaking, till some movement of the old armorer cut off the ray of sunlight. Then, still thrilling secretly, I leaned back and listened again to the sound of the polishing rag, swish, swish, rubbing rust from the rivets. Constance worked with the embroidery over her knees, now and then pausing to examine more closely the pattern in the colored plate from the Metropolitan Museum. "Who's this for?" I asked. Hallberg explained that in addition to the treasures of armor in the Metropolitan Museum, of which he had been appointed armorer, he had also had charge of several collections belonging to rich amateurs. This was the missing greave of a famous suit which a client of his had traced to a little shop in Paris on the Quai d'Orsay. Quai d'Orsay, I don't know. He, Hallberg, had negotiated for and secured the greave, and now the suit was complete. He laid down his hammer and read me the history of the suit, traced since 1450 from owner to owner until it was acquired by Thomas Stainbridge. When his superb collection was sold, this client of Hallberg's brought the suit, and since then the search for the missing greave had been pushed until it was, almost by accident, located in Paris. "Did you continue the search so persistently without any certainty of the greave being still in existence?" I demanded. "Of course," he replied coolly. Then, for the first time ever, I took a personal interest in Hallberg. "It was worth something to you," I ventured. "No," he replied, laughing. "My pleasure in finding it was my reward." "Have you no ambition to be rich?" I asked, smiling. "My one ambition is to be the best art—" Excuse me, hold on. Oh my gosh. "My one ambition is to be the best armorer in the world," he answered gravely. Constance asked me if I had seen the ceremonies at the Lethal Chamber. She herself had noticed cavalry passing up Broadway that morning and had wished to see the inauguration, but her father wanted the banner finished, and so she stated his request. "Did you see your cousin, Mr. Castaigne, there?" she asked, with the slightest tremor of her soft eyelashes. "No," I replied carelessly. Louis' regiment is maneuvering out in Westchester County." I rose and picked up my hat and cane. "Are you going upstairs to see that lunatic again?" laughed old Hawberk. If Hawberk knew how I loathed the word lunatic, he would never use it in my presence. It rouses certain feelings within me which I do not care to explain. However, I answered him quietly. "I think I shall drop in and see Mr. Wilde for a moment or two." "Poor fellow," said Constance with a shake of the head. "Must be hard to live alone year after year, poor, crippled, and almost demented. It is very good of you, Mr. Castaigne, to visit him as often as you do." "I think he is vicious," observed Hawberk, beginning again with his hammer. I listened to the golden tinkle on the greave plates, and when he had finished I replied, "No, he is not vicious, nor is he the least demented. His mind is a wonder chamber from which he can extract treasures that you and I would give years of our life to acquire." Hawberk laughed. I continued a little impatiently. "He knows history as no one else would know it. Nothing, however, Nothing, however trivial, escapes his search, and his memory is so absolute, so precise in details, that were it known in New York that such a man existed, the people could not honor him enough." "Nonsense," muttered Hawberk, searching on the floor for a fallen rivet. "Is it nonsense?" I asked, managing to suppress what I felt. "Is it nonsense when he says that the tassets and cussards of the enameled suit of armor commonly known as the Prince's Emblazoned can be found among a mass of rusty theatrical properties, broken stoves, and rag pickers' refuse in a garret in Pell Street?" Hawberk's hammer fell to the ground, but he picked it up and asked with a great deal of calm how I knew that the tassets and the left cussard were missing from the Prince's Emblazoned. "I did not know it until Mr. Wilde mentioned it to me the other day. He said they were in a garret of 998 Pell Street." "Nonsense!" he cried, but I noticed his hand trembling under his leather apron. "Is this nonsense, too?" I asked pleasantly. "Is it nonsense that when Mr. Wilde continually speaks of you as the Marquis of Avonshire and of Miss Constance—" I did not finish, for Constance had started to her feet with terror written on every feature. Hawberk looked at me and slowly smoothed his leather apron. "That is impossible," he observed. "Mr. Wilde may know a great many things." "About armor, for instance, and the Prince's Emblazoned," I interposed, smiling. "Yes," he continued slowly, "about armor also maybe, but he is wrong in regard to the Marquis of Avonshire, who, as you know, killed his wife's traducer years ago, I hate these words, and went to Australia, where he did not long survive his wife." "Mr. Wilde is wrong," murmured Constance. Her lips were blanched, but her voice was sweet and calm. "Let us agree, if you please, that in this one circumstance Mr. Wilde is wrong," I said. End of chapter 1. Some of those words are fucked up. Let me click through my notifications real quick. So, Mr. Wilde is the name of the guy they keep talking about. He lives apparently above Hawberk the Armorer, and Hawberk thinks he's completely insane. Constance, his daughter, thinks that he's just a really sad mental case who needs some love and he's pathetic. But Mr. Castaigne disagrees completely, and he seems to be right. He seems to be telling Hawberk things that, like, seriously fuck with him. He seems to be onto something about Mr. Wilde. So we're gonna meet Mr. Wilde now. Chapter 2. I climbed the 3 dilapidated flights of stairs which I had so often climbed before, and knocked at a small door on the end of the corridor. Mr. Wilde opened the door, and I walked in. When he had double-locked the door and pushed a heavy chest against it, he came and sat down beside me, peering up into my face with his little, light-colored eyes. Half a dozen new scratches covered his nose and cheeks, and the silver wires which supported his artificial ears had become displaced. I thought I had never seen him so hideously fascinating. He had no ears. The artificial ones, which now stood out at an angle from the fine wire, were his one weakness. They were made of wax and painted a shell pink, but the rest of his face was yellow. He might better have reveled in the luxury of some artificial fingers for his left hand, which was absolutely fingerless, but it seemed to cause him no inconvenience, and he was satisfied with his wax ears. He was very small, scarcely higher than a child of 10, but his arms were magnificently developed, as thick as thighs. And his thighs as thick as any athlete's. Still, the most remarkable thing about Mr. Wilde was that a man of his marvelous intelligence and knowledge should have such a head. It was flat and pointed, like the heads of many of those unfortunates whom people imprison in asylums for the weak-minded. Many called him insane, but I knew him to be as sane as I was. I do not deny that he was eccentric. The mania he had for keeping that cat and teasing her until she flew at his face like a demon was certainly eccentric. I never could understand why he kept the creature, nor what pleasure he found in shutting himself up in his room with this surly, vicious beast. I remember once glancing up from the manuscript I was studying by the light of some tallow dips and seeing Mr. Wilde squatting motionless on his high chair, his eyes fairly blazing with excitement, while the cat, which had risen from her place before the stove, came creeping across the floor right at him. Before I could move, she flattened her belly to the ground, crouched, trembled, and sprang into his face. Howling and foaming, they rolled over and over on the floor, scratching and clawing, until the cat screamed and fled under the cabinet. And Mr. Wilde turned over on his back, his limbs contracting and curling up like the legs of a dying spider. He was eccentric. Mr. Wilde had climbed into his high chair, and after studying my face, picked up a dog-eared ledger and opened it. Henry B. Matthews, he read, bookkeeper with Wysett & Company, dealers in church ornaments. Called April 3rd. Reputation damaged on the racetrack. Known as a welcher. Reputation to be repaired by August 1st. Retainer, $5. He turned the page and ran his fingerless knuckles down the closely written columns. P. Green Dozenberry, a minister of the gospel, Fair Beach, New Jersey. Reputation damaged in the Bowery. To be repaired as soon as possible. Retainer, $100. He coughed and added, called April 6th. Then you are not in need of money, Mr. Wilde, I inquired. Listen. He coughed again. Mrs. C. Hamilton Chester of Chester Park, New York City. Called April 7th. Reputation damaged in France. To be repaired by October 1st. Retainer, $500. Note: C. Hamilton Chester, captain at USS Avalanche, ordered home from South Sea Squadron October 1st. Well, I said, the profession of a repairer of reputations is lucrative. His colorless eyes sought mine. I only wanted to demonstrate that I was correct. You said it was impossible to succeed as a repairer of reputations, that even if I did succeed in certain cases, it would cost me more than I would gain by it. Today I have 500 men in my employ, who are poorly paid, but who pursue the work with such an enthusiasm, which possibly may be born of fear. These men enter every shade and grade of society. Some even are pillars of the most exclusive social temples. Others are the prop and pride of the financial world. Still others hold undisputed sway among the fancy and the talent. I choose them at my leisure from those who reply to my advertisements. It is easy enough. They're all cowards. I could treble the number in 20 days if I wished. So you see, those who have in their keeping the reputations of the fellow citizens, I have in my pay. They may turn on you, I suggested. He rubbed his thumb over his cropped ears and adjusted the wax substitutes. I think not, he murmured thoughtfully. I seldom have to apply the whip, and then only once. Besides, they like their wages. How do you apply the whip? I demanded. His face for a moment was awful to look upon. His eyes dwindled to a pair of green sparks. I invite them to come and have a little chat with me, he said in a soft voice. A knock at the door interrupted him, and his face resumed its amiable expression. Who is it? He inquired. Mr. Stylet, was the answer. Come tomorrow, replied Mr. Wilde. Impossible, began the other, but was silenced by a short bark from Mr. Wilde. Come tomorrow, he repeated. We heard somebody move away from the door and turn the corner by the stairway. Who's that? I asked. Arnold Stylet, owner and editor-in-chief of the great New York Daily. He drummed on the ledger with his fingerless hand, adding, I pay him very badly, but he thinks it's a good bargain. Arnold Stylet, I repeated, amazed. Yes, said Mr. Wilde with a self-satisfied cough. The cat, which had entered the room as he spoke, hesitated, looked up at him, and snarled. He climbed down from the chair and, squatting on the floor, took the creature into his arms and caressed her. The cat ceased snarling and presently began a loud purring, which seemed to increase in timbre as he stroked her. "Where are the notes?" I asked. He pointed to the table, and for the 100th time I picked up the bundle of manuscript, entitled The Imperial Dynasty of America. One by one I studied the well-worn pages, worn only by my own handling, and although I knew all by heart from the beginning, which read, when from Carcosa, the Hyades, Hastor, and Aldebaran, to Castaigne, Louis de Calvados, born December 19th, 1877. I read it with an eager, rapt attention, pausing to repeat parts of it aloud, and dwelling especially on Hildred de Calvados, only son of Hildred Castaigne and Ethide Landes Castaigne, first in succession, etc., etc. When I finished, Mr. Wilde nodded and coughed. "Speaking of your legitimate ambition," he said, "how do Constance and Louis get along?" "She loves him," I replied simply. The cat on his knee suddenly turned and struck at his eyes, and he flung her off and climbed onto the chair opposite me. "And Dr. Archer? But that's a matter you can settle any time you wish," he added. "Yes," I replied, "Dr. Archer can wait. But it's time I saw my cousin Louis." "It is time," he repeated. Then he took another ledger from the table and ran over the leaves rapidly. "We are now in communication with 10,000 men," he muttered. "We can count on 100,000 within the first 28 hours, and in 48 hours the state will rise en masse. The country follows the state, and the portion that will not, I mean California, the Northwest, might better have never been inhabited. I shall not send them the yellow sign." The blood rushed to my head, but I only answered, "A new broom sweeps clean." The ambition of Caesar and of Napoleon pales before that which could not rest until it had seized the minds of men and controlled even their unborn thoughts, said Mr. Wilde. "You are speaking of the king in yellow," I groaned with a shudder. "He's a king who emperors have served." "I am content to serve him," I replied. Mr. Wilde sat, rubbing his ears with his crippled hand. "Perhaps Constance does not love him," he suggested. I started to reply, but a sudden burst of military music from the street below drowned my voice. The 20th Dragoon Regiment, formerly in garrison at Mount St. Vincent, was returning from the maneuvers in Westchester County to its new barracks on East Washington Square. It was my cousin's regiment. They were a fine lot of fellows in their pale blue tight-fitting jackets, jaunty busbies, and white riding breeches with the double yellow stripe, into which their limbs seemed molded. Every other squadron was armed with lances from the metal points of which fluttered yellow and white pennons. The band passed, playing the regimental march. Then came the colonel and staff, the horses crowding and trampling, while their heads bobbed in unison, and the pennons fluttered from their lance points. The troopers, who rode with the beautiful English seat, looked down as berries from their bloodless campaign among the farms of Westchester, and the music of their sabers against their stirrups and the jingle of the spurs and carbines was delightful to me. I saw Louis riding with his squadron. He was as handsome an officer as I have ever seen. Mr. Wilde, who had mounted a chair by the window, saw him too, but said nothing. Louis turned and looked straight at Hallberg's shop as he passed, and I could see the flush on his brown cheeks. I think Constance must have been at the window. When the last troopers had clattered by and the last pennons vanished into South Fifth Avenue, Mr. Wilde clambered out of his chair and dragged the chest away from the door. "Yes," he said, "it is time that you saw your cousin Louis." He unlocked the door, and I picked up my hat and stick and stepped into the corridor. The stairs were dark. Groping about, I set my foot on something soft, which snarled and spit, and I aimed a murderous blow at the cat, but my cane shivered to splinters against the balustrade, and the beast scurried back into Mr. Wilde's room. Passing Hallberg's door again, I saw him still at work on the armor, but I did not stop, and stepping out into Bleecker Street, I followed it into Wooster, skirted the grounds of the Lethal Chamber, and crossing Washington Park, went straight to my rooms in the Benedict. Here I hunched comfortably, read the Herald and the Meteor, and finally went to the steel safe in my bedroom and set the time combination. The 3 3/4 minutes which it is necessary to wait while the time lock is opening are to me golden moments. From the instant I set the combination to the moment when I grasp the knobs and swing back the solid steel doors, I live in an ecstasy of expectation. Those moments must be like moments passed in paradise. I know what I am to find at the end of the time limit. I know what the massive safe holds secure for me alone. And the exquisite pleasure of waiting is hardly enhanced when the safe opens and I lift, from its velvet crown, a diadem of purest gold blazing with diamonds. I do this every day, and yet the joy of waiting and at last touching again the diadem only seems to increase as the days pass. It is a diadem fit for a king among kings, an emperor among emperors. The king in yellow might scorn it, but it shall be worn by his royal servant. Okay, that's not the end of the chapter, but we can take a break and talk a little bit, and I can get a drink. No, this is not a very nice bookmark, but I will use it. So we've met Mr. Wilde now. We get to hear a little bit of their private conversation. It was a little bit unnerving. They mentioned pretty much just most of the characters that Mr. Castaigne was already talking about. He talked about his Dr. Archer, is his doctor that saw him in the asylum that he spent time in, and he talked about his cousin Louis and Constance. He said Mr. Wilde was pretty upset by the news that Constance and Louis are in love. Let's see if we can go back to that manuscript. The Imperial Dynasty of America was the name of that manuscript. He dwells especially on the line, Hildred de Calvados, only son of Hildred Castaigne and Ethid Landys Castaigne, first in succession, etc., etc. Which is not the last line. The last line is Castaigne, Louis de Calvados, born December 19th, 1877. Which is Louis. Not sure what that's all about just yet. Talked a little bit about Mr. Wilde. He is the titular repairer of reputations. It was pretty obvious if you were listening closely that he is a professional blackmailer. That's his job. He's repairing reputations, and he's having a lot of fun paying people badly and scorning people. He's doing a pretty good job at it. He's like an informant of a type. And he's making a lot of money, and he seems to be very concerned about how many people he can get under his control. He says that he's already got old school Union Buster. He says that he's already got 10,000 people that he has influence over. Not necessarily that many on his payroll, but he has influence over probably about 10,000 people. So, and he says, if I keep working, I can get it up to 100,000, and soon I can get the whole state. And since we're in, I believe we're in New York, he says, if we can get the whole state of New York under my influence, then there goes the whole nation. Except for maybe California, which, screw them anyways. Then he says, I shall not send them the yellow sign, which makes Hildred shudder a little bit. Kind of some weird conversations they had up there. Maybe I'm kind of feeling that the guy who said Mr. Wilde was crazy might be right. But he's making fucking bank. That's really all that matters. He's on his grind set, so, And then Mr. Castaigne went home, and he talks about how he has a beautiful, is it diadem or diadem? I think it's diadem. A beautiful gold and diamond diadem, which is kind of like a tiara. It's kind of a crown for a royal. And Every day he opens up his safe and waits the 3 minutes for the time lock, and then he admires it, and like that's just a daily routine for him. It's a Horcrux, yeah. He seems to be having a lot of fun doing that. He says it brings him great pleasure. And then he says, the king in yellow might scorn it, but it shall be worn by his royal servant. That was the last thing we read. Alright, let's get back at it. I held it in my arms until the alarm in the safe rang harshly, and then tenderly, proudly, I replaced it and shut the steel doors. I walked slowly back into my study, which faces Washington Square, and leaned on the windowsill. The afternoon sun poured into my windows, and a gentle breeze stirred the branches of the elms and maples in the park, now covered with buds and tender foliage. A flock of pigeons circled about the tower of the Memorial Church, sometimes alighting on the purple-tiled roof, sometimes wheeling downward to the lotos fountain. Lotos. It's like if somebody mispronounced lotus and wrote out phonetically. Lotos fountain on the front of the marble arch. The gardeners were busy with the flower beds around the fountain, and the freshly turned earth smelled sweet and spicy. A lawn-mower drawn by a fat white horse clinked across the garden sward, the green sward, and watering carts poured showers of spray over the asphalt drives. Around the statue of Peter Stuyvesant, this guy and his fucking names, around the statue of Peter Stuyvesant, which in 1897 had replaced the monstrosity supposed to represent Garibaldi, children played in the spring sunshine, and nurse girls wheeled elaborate baby carriages with a reckless disregard for the pasty-faced occupants, which could probably be explained by the presence of half a dozen trim dragoon troopers, languidly lolling on the benches. Through the trees, the Washington Memorial Arch glistened like silver in the sunshine, and beyond, on the eastern extremity of the square, the gray stone barracks of the dragoons and the white granite artillery stables were alive with color and motion. I looked at the lethal chamber on the corner of the square opposite. A few curious people still lingered about the gilded iron building, but inside the grounds and paths were deserted. I watched the fountains ripple and sparkle. The sparrows had already found this new bathing nook, and the basins were covered with the dusty feathered little things. 2 or 3 white peacocks picked their way across the lawns, and a drab-colored pigeon sat so motionless on the arm of one of the fates that it seemed to be a part of the sculptured stone. As I was turning carelessly away, a slight commotion in the group of curious loiterers around the gates attracted my attention. A young man had entered and was advancing with nervous strides along the gravel path which leads to the bronze doors of the lethal chamber. He paused a moment before the fates, and as he raised his head to those 3 mysterious faces, the pigeon rose from its sculptured perch, circled about for a moment, and wheeled to the east. The young man pressed his hand to his face, and then with an undefinable gesture sprang up the marble steps. The bronze doors closed behind him. Half an hour later the loiterers slouched away, and the frightened pigeon returned to its perch in the arms of fate. I put on my hat and went out to the park for a little walk before dinner. As I crossed the central driveway, a group of officers passed, and one of them called out, "Hello, Hildred," and came back to shake hands with me. It was my cousin Louis, who stood smiling and tapping his spurred heels with his riding whip. "Just back from Westchester," he said. "Been doing the bullock, milking curds, dairymaids and sunbonnets who say, how, and I don't think when you tell them they are pretty. They say how, and I don't think when you tell them they are pretty. I'm nearly dead for a square meal at Delmonico's. What's the news?" "There is none," I replied pleasantly. "I saw your regiment coming in this morning." "Did you? I didn't see you. Where were you?" "In Mr. Wilde's window." "Oh, hell," he began impatiently. "That man is stark mad. I don't understand why you—" But he saw how annoyed I felt by this outburst, and he begged my pardon. "Really, old chap," he said, "I don't mean to run down a man you like, but for the life of me I can't see what the deuce you find in common with Mr. Wilde. He's not well bred, to put it generously. He's hideously deformed. His head is the head of a criminally insane person. You know yourself he's been in an asylum." "So have I interrupted calmly. Louis, startled and confused for a moment, recovered and slapped me heartily on the shoulder. "You were completely cured," he began, but I stopped him again. "I suppose you mean that I was simply acknowledged to have never been insane." "Of course, that's what I meant." He laughed. I disliked his laugh because I knew it was forced, but I nodded gaily and asked him where he was going. Louis looked after his brother officers, who had now almost reached the Broadway. We had intended to sample a Brunswick cocktail, but to tell you the truth, I was anxious for an excuse to go on and see Holbrook instead. "Come along, I'll make you my excuse." We found old Harbrook, neatly attired in a fresh spring suit, standing at the door of his shop and sniffing the air. "I had just decided to take Constance for a little stroll before dinner," he replied when the impetuous volley of questions from Louis. "We thought of walking on the park terrace along the North River." At that moment Constance appeared and grew pale and rosy by turns as Louis bent over her small gloved fingers. I tried to excuse myself, alleging an engagement uptown, but Louis and Constance would not listen, and I saw I was expected to remain and engage old Hallberg's attention. After all, it would be just as well if I kept my eye on Louis, I thought, and when they hailed a Spring Street horse car, I got in after them and took my seat beside the armorer. The beautiful line of parks and granite terraces overlooking the wharves along the North River, which were built in 1910 and finished in the autumn of 1917, had become one of the most popular promenades in the metropolis. They extended from the Battery to 190th Street, overlooking the noble river and affording a fine view of the Jersey shore and the highlands opposite. Cafes and restaurants were scattered here and there among the trees, and twice a week military bands from the garrison played in the kiosks and the parapets. Is that how you spell the word kiosk? Holy shit. That's a fucking dark word. We sat down in the sunshine on the bench at the foot of the equestrian statue of General Sheridan. Constance tipped her sunshade to shield her eyes, and she and Louis began a murmuring conversation which was impossible to catch. Old Hallberg, leaning on his ivory-headed cane, lighted an excellent cigar, the mate to which I politely refused, and smiled at vacancy. The sun hung low above the Staten Island woods, and the bay was dyed with golden hues reflected from the sun-warmed sails of the shipping in the harbor. Brigs, schooners, yachts, clumsy ferry boats, their decks swarming with people, railroad transports carrying lines of brown, blue, and white freight cars, stately sound steamers, de-class tramp steamers, coasters, dredgers, scows, and everywhere pervading the entire bay, impudent little tugs, puffing and whistling officiously. These were the craft which churned the sunlight waters as far as the eye could reach. In calm contrast to the hurry of sailing vessel and steamer, a silent fleet of white warships lay motionless in midstream. Constance's merry laugh aroused me from my reverie. "What are you staring at?" she inquired. Nothing. The fleet." I smiled. Then Louis told us what the vessels were, pointing out each by its relative position in the old red fort on Governor's Island. "That little cigar-shaped thing is a torpedo boat," he explained. "There are 4 more lying close together. They are the Tarpon, the Falcon, the Sea Fox, and the Octopus. The gunboats just above are the Princeton, the Champlain, the Stillwater, and the Erie. Next to them lie the cruisers, Farragut and Los Angeles, and above them the ships California and Dakota, and the Washington, which is the flagship. Those 2 squatty-looking chunks of metal which are anchored there off Castle William are the double-turreted monitors, terrible and magnificent. Behind them lies the ram, Oscola." Constance looked at him with deep approval in her beautiful eyes. "What loads of things you know for a soldier," she said, and we all joined in on the laugh which followed. Presently Louis arose with a nod to us and offered his arm to Constance, and they strolled away along the river wall. Hallberg watched them for a moment and then turned to me. "Mr. Wilde was right," he said. "I have found the missing tassets in the left cussard of the Princess Emblazoned in a vile old junk garret on Pell Street." 998? I inquired with a smile. "Yes." "Mr. Wilde is a very intelligent man," I observed. I want to give him the credit of his most important discovery," continued Hallberg, "and I intend it shall be known that he is entitled to the fame of it." "He won't thank you for that," I answered sharply. "Please, say nothing about it." "Do you know what it's worth?" said Hallberg. "No, $50 perhaps." "It is valued at $500, but the owner of the Princess Emblazoned will give $2,000 to the person who completes his suit. That reward also belongs to Mr. Wilde." "He doesn't want it. He refuses it," I answered angrily. "What do you know about Mr. Wilde? He doesn't need the money. He is rich, or he will be, richer than any living man except myself." "What do we care for money, then? What will we care, he and I, when what?" demanded Hallberg, astonished. "You will see," I replied on my guard again. He looked at me narrowly, much as Dr. Archer used to, and I knew he thought I was mentally unsound. Perhaps it was fortunate for him that he did not use the word lunatic just then. No, I replied to his unspoken thoughts. I am not mentally weak. My mind is as healthy as Mr. Wilde's. I do not care to explain just yet what I have on hand. But it is an investment which will pay more than mere gold, silver, and precious stones. It will secure the happiness and prosperity of a continent. Yes, a hemisphere. Oh, said Hallberg. And eventually, I continued more quietly, it will secure the happiness of the whole world. And incidentally, your own happiness and prosperity as well as Mr. Wilde's? Exactly. I smiled, but I could have throttled him for talking in that tone. He looked at me in silence for a while and then said very gently, "Why don't you give up your books and studies, Mr. Castaigne, and take a tramp along the mountains somewhere or other? You used to be fond of fishing. Take a cast or two at the trout and the wranglies." "I don't care for fishing any more," I answered, without a shade of annoyance in my voice. "You used to be fond of everything," he continued. "Athletics, yachting, shooting, riding." "I have never cared to ride since my fall," I said quietly. "Oh, yes, your fall," he repeated, looking away from me. I thought this nonsense had gone far enough, so I brought the conversation back to Mr. Wilde, but he was scanning my face again in a manner highly offensive to me. "Mr. Wilde," he repeated. "Do you know what he did this afternoon? He came downstairs and nailed a sign over the hall door next to mine. It read, 'Mr. Wilde, repairer of reputations, third bell.' Do you know what a repairer of reputations can be?" "I do," I replied, suppressing a little rage within. "Oh," he said again. Louis and Constance came strolling by and stopped to ask if we would join them. Hallberg looked at his watch. At the same moment a puff of smoke shot up from the casemates of Castle William, and the boom of the sunset gun rolled across the water and was re-echoed from the highlands opposite. The flag came running down from the flagpole, the bugles sounded on the white decks of warships, and the first electric lights sparkled out from the Jersey shore. As I turned into the city with Hallberg, I heard Constance murmur something to Louis which I did not understand, but Louis responded, "My darling," in reply, and again, walking ahead with Mr. Hallberg through the square, I heard a murmur of "sweetheart" and "my own Constance," and I knew the time had nearly arrived when I should speak of important matters with my cousin Louis. End of chapter 2. Shoo. 1 hour already down. This is one of the longest of the. There are 4 parts of this book. I think this is the second longest. It's the longest or the second longest. But Repairer of Reputations is part 1. And we're still working on it. We're not quite done. We're getting there, though. So now, we can kind of see that things are not... It's becoming, I think, obvious to us that things are not quite um, the way Mr. Hildred Castaigne says them to be. We may be getting a few hints here and there that he may be kind of an unreliable narrator. Perhaps. He's said some weird stuff, you know. He's said a few strange things. His interaction with Louis is one that I think is good to highlight. His cousin says, "Well, why do you hang out with Mr. Wilde? He's been in an asylum." And Hildred goes, "Oh, so have I." And there's that moment where Louis is like, "Oh, but you were cured." And Hildred's like, well, I think you meant to say that they acknowledged that I was never insane and it was a mistake." And Louis goes, "Oh yeah, my bad. I totally meant to say that." That's interesting. I think that's very telling. I think that conversation is definitely more than the surface level. Um, but we don't know the extent, really, to which he is unreliable. We definitely don't know that. Just replying to some messages real quick. Take a little break. Not going to be a full-on break. I'm going to see if I can clear a few more sections before I go on for a full-on BRB. Alright. You gotta go BRB because I gotta get drink? Well, fuck it, I'll just pee now. 1 minute. Don't let that stop you. Too late, bitch. Alright, I'm back. Is everybody good? Don't want to leave the station without anybody who's still on their BRB, so we know. Crowd, I know you're only listening in ear, but how's it going? Still live? We still got you? You still there? Give me a heads up. I'm keeping an eye on the user list, the viewer list or whatever, but it's not, doesn't work very well on Streamlabs. It doesn't tend to be very accurate. Barely. Okay. So far, welcome back. Kitchen work and listen. Nice. It's a good day for housework. So far, The King in Yellow has been mentioned basically I think three times. First, as a book by Mr. Castaigne and his own experiences about his time in the asylum. Then it's discussed between Castaigne and Mr. Wilde, kind of as a person or like as a god. Talk about how he's above all other kings and emperors, so I guess kind of like a god. And then he's mentioned by Castaigne when he's admiring the crown, the diadem. He says, this might not be good enough for the king in yellow, but it is good enough for his servant. So it's a book. It's been mentioned as a book and as a character who possibly is like a spiritual or like a deity or has, like not just a dude, basically, is what we know. I had to disappear for a hot sec. What's the timestamp? Like right now, it's currently 1 hour and 4 minutes into the recording, if that's what you're asking. It's up in the snippet I missed later. Yeah. I mean, if it was like a long time, then I would encourage you to just like nothing's gonna make sense. Like I would encourage you to not stay if it was long. If it was a long time, I would encourage you to leave and do the whole thing front to back so it makes sense. But I can't stop you. You know, I'm not gonna kick you out. It's up to you. But I would strongly advise that. But one way or another, we're gonna progress. Here we go. No, it was just a bit. Okay, I'll trust you. Did my bookmark fall out? No, here it is. Chapter 3. One morning early in May, I stood before the steel safe in my bedroom, trying on the gold and jeweled crown. The diamonds flashed fire as I turned to the mirror, and the heavy beaten gold burned like a halo about my head. I remembered Camilla's agonized scream and the awful words echoing through the dim streets of Carcosa. They were the last lines in the first act, and I dared not think of what followed, dared not, even in the spring sunshine, there in my own room, surrounded with familiar objects, reassured by the bustle of the street and the voices of the servants in the hallway outside. For those poisoned words had dropped slowly into my heart, as death's sweet drops upon a bedsheet is absorbed. Death's sweat drops upon a bedsheet and is absorbed. Trembling, I put the diadem from my head and wiped my forehead, but I thought of Hastur and of my own rightful ambition, and I remembered Mr. Wilde as I had last left him, his face all torn and bloody from the claws of that devil's creature. And what he said, what he said. The alarm bell in the safe began to whir harshly, and I knew my time was up, but I would not heed it, and replacing the flashing circlet upon my head, I turned defiantly to the mirror. I stood for a long time absorbed in the changing expression of my own eyes. The mirror reflected a face which was like my own, but whiter and so thin I hardly recognized it. And all the time I kept repeating between my clenched teeth, "The day has come, the day has come," while the alarm in the safe whirred and clamored and the diamonds sparkled and flamed above my brow. I heard a door open, but did not heed it. It was only when I saw two faces in the mirror. It was only when another face rose over my shoulder, and two other eyes met mine. I wheeled like a flash and seized a long knife from my dressing table, and my cousin sprang back very pale, crying, "Hildred, for God's sake!" Then as my hand fell, he said, "It's I, Louis. Don't you know me?" I stood silent. I could not have spoken for my life. He walked up to me and took the knife from my hand. "What is all this?" he inquired in a gentle voice. "Are you ill?" "No," I replied, but I doubt if he heard me. "Come, come, old fellow," he cried. "Take off that brass crown and toddle into the study. Are you going to a masquerade? What's all this theatrical tinsel, anyway?" I was glad he thought the crown was made of brass and paste, yet I didn't like him any the better for thinking so. I let him take it from my hand, knowing it was best to humor him. He tossed the splendid diadem in the air, and catching it, turned to me, smiling. "It's dear at 50 cents, he said. "What's it for?" I did not answer, but took the circlet from his hands, and placing it in the safe, shut the massive steel door. The alarm ceased its infernal din at once. He watched me curiously, but did not seem to notice the sudden ceasing of the alarm. He did, however, speak of the safe as a biscuit box. Fearing lest he might examine the combination, I led my way into the study. Louis threw himself on the sofa and flicked at flies with his eternal riding whip. He wore his fatigue uniform with the braided jacket and jaunty cap, and I noticed that his riding boots were all splashed with red mud. "Where have you been?" I inquired. "Jumping mud creeks in Jersey," he said. "I haven't had time to change yet. I was rather in a hurry to see you. Haven't you got a glass of something? I'm dead tired. Been in the saddle 24 hours. I gave him some brandy from my medicinal store, which he drank with a grimace. "Damn bad stuff," he observed. I'll give you an address where they sell brandy that is brandy." "It's good enough for my needs," I said indifferently. "I use it to rub my chest with." He stared and flicked another fly. "See here, old fellow," he began. "I've got something to suggest to you. It's 4 years now that you've shut yourself up here like an owl, never going anywhere, never taking any healthy exercise, never doing a damn thing but poring over those books up there on the mantelpiece." He glanced along the row of shelves. "Napoleon, Napoleon, Napoleon," he read. "For heaven's sake, have you nothing but Napoleon there?" "I wish they were bound in gold," I said. "But wait, yes, there is another book. The King in Yellow." I looked him steadily in the eye. "Have you never read it?" I asked. I? No, thank God, I don't want to be driven crazy. I saw he regretted his speech as soon as he had uttered it. There is only one word which I loathe more than I do lunatic, and that word is crazy. But I controlled myself and asked him why he thought the King in Yellow was dangerous. I don't know, he said hastily. I only remember the excitement it created and the denunciations from pulpit and press. I believe the author shot himself after bringing forth this monstrosity, didn't he? I understand he is still alive, I answered. That's probably true, he muttered. Bullets couldn't kill a fiend like that. It is a book of great truths, I said. Yes, he replied, of truths which send men frantic and blast their lives. I don't care if the thing is, as they say, the very supreme essence of art. It's a crime to have written it, and I, for one, shall never open its pages. Is that what you have come to tell me? I said. No, he said, I came to tell you that I'm going to be married. I believe for a moment my heart ceased to beat, but I kept my eyes on his face. Yes, he continued, smiling happily, married to the sweetest girl on earth. Constance Hallberg, I said mechanically. How did you know? He cried, astonished. I didn't know myself until that evening last April, when we strolled down to the embankment before dinner. When is it to be? I asked. It was to have been next September, but an hour ago a dispatch came ordering our regiment to the Presidio San Francisco. We leave at noon tomorrow. Tomorrow, he repeated. Just think, Hildred, tomorrow I shall be the happiest fellow that ever drew breath in this jolly world, for Constance will go with me. I offered him my hand in congratulation, and he seized and shook it like the good-natured fool he was, or pretended to be. I'm going to get my squadron as a wedding present, he rattled on. Captain and Miss Louis Castaigne. Eh, Hildred? Then he told me where it was to be, and who were to be there, and made me promise to come in and be best man. I set my teeth and listened to his boyish chatter without showing what I felt, but I was getting to the limit of my endurance, and when he jumped up and, switching his spurs till they jingled, said he must go, I did not detain him. There's one thing I want to ask of you, I said quietly. Out with it! It's promised, he laughed. I want you to meet me for a quarter of an hour's talk tonight. Oh, of course, if you wish, he said, somewhat puzzled. Where? Anywhere. In the park, there. What time, Hildred? Midnight. What in the name of... he began, but checked himself and laughingly assented. I watched him go down the stairs and hurry away, his saber banging at every stride. He turned to Bleecker Street, and I knew he was going to see Constance. I gave him 10 minutes to disappear, and then followed in his footsteps, taking with me the jeweled crown and the silken robe embroidered with the yellow sign. When I turned into Bleecker Street and entered the doorway which bore the sign, Mr. Wilde, Repair of Reputations, third bell, I saw old Hallberg moving about in his shop, and imagined I heard Constance's voice in the parlor, but I avoided them both, and hurried up the trembling stairways to Mr. Wilde's apartment. I knocked and entered without ceremony. Mr. Wilde lay groaning on the floor, his face covered with blood, his clothes torn to shreds. Drops of blood were scattered about over the carpet, which had also been ripped and frayed in the evidently recent struggle. It's that cursed cat, he said, ceasing his groans and turning his colorless eyes to me. She attacked me while I was asleep. I believe she will kill me yet. This was too much, so I went into the kitchen and, seizing a hatchet from the pantry, started to find the infernal beast and settle her then and there. My search was fruitless, and after a while I gave it up and came back to find Mr. Wilde squatting on his high chair by the table. He had washed his face and changed his clothes. The great furrows which the cat's claws had plowed up his face he had filled with collodion, and a rag hid the wound in his throat. I told him I should kill the cat when I came across her, but he only shook his head and turned to open the ledger before him. He read name after name of the people who had come to him in regard to their reputation, and the sums he had amassed were startling. I put on the screws now and then, he explained. One day or other some of these people will assassinate you, I insisted. Do you think so? He said, rubbing his mutilated ears. It was useless to argue with him, so I took down the manuscript entitled Imperial Dynasty of America, and for the last time I should ever take it down in Mr. Wilde's study. I read it through, thrilling and trembling with pleasure. When I had finished, Mr. Wilde took the manuscript and, turning to the dark passage which leads from his study to his bedchamber, called out in a loud voice, "Vance!" Then for the first time I noticed a man crouching there in the shadow. How I had overlooked him during my search for the cat I cannot imagine. "Vance, come in!" cried Mr. Wilde. The figure rose and crept towards us, and I shall never forget the face that he raised to mine, as the light from the window illuminated it. "Vance, this is Mr. Castaigne," said Mr. Wilde. Before he had finished speaking, the man threw himself on the ground before the table, crying and gasping, "Oh God! Oh my God! Help me! Forgive me! Oh, Mr. Castaigne, keep that man away! You cannot mean it! You are different! Save me! I am broken down! I was in a madhouse, and now, when all was coming right, when I had forgotten the king in yellow, oh, but I shall go mad again! I shall go mad!" His voice died into a choking rattle, for Mr. Wilde had leapt on him, and his right hand encircled the man's throat. When Vance fell in a heap on the floor, Mr. Wilde clambered nimbly in his chair again, and rubbing his mangled ears with the stump of his hand, he turned to me and asked for the ledger. I reached it down from the shelf, and he opened it. After a moment searching among the beautifully written pages, he coughed complacently and pointed to the name Vance. "Vance," he read aloud. "Osgood Oswald Vance." At the sound of his name, the man on the floor raised his head and turned a convulsed face to Mr. Wilde. His eyes were injected with blood and his lips tumefied. "Called April 28th," continued Mr. Wilde. "Occupation: cashier at the Seaforth National Bank. Has reserved a term of forgery at Sing Sing, from whence he was transferred to an asylum for the criminal insane. Pardoned by the Governor of New York and discharged from the asylum January 19, 1918. Reputation damaged at Sheepshead Bay. Rumors that he lives beyond his income. Reputation to be repaired at once. Retainer, $1,500. Note: has embezzled sums amounting to $30,000 since March 20, 1919. Excellent family and secured present position through uncle's influence. Father, president of Seaforth Bank." I looked at the man on the floor. "Get up, Vance," said Mr. Wilde in a gentle voice. "Oh, sorry. Get up, Vance," said Mr. Wilde in a gentle voice. Vance rose as if hypnotized. "You will do as we suggest now," observed Mr. Wilde, and opening the manuscript he read the entire history of the Imperial Dynasty of America. Then, in a kind and soothing murmur, he ran over the important points with Vance, who stood like one stunned. His eyes were so blank and vacant that I imagined he had become half-witted, and remarked it to Mr. Wilde, who replied that it was of no consequence anyway. Very patiently we pointed out to Vance what his share in the affair would be, and he seemed to understand after a while. Mr. Wilde explained the manuscript, using several volumes on heraldry to substantiate the result of his researches. He mentioned the establishment of the dynasty in Carcosa, the lakes which connected Hastor, Aldebaran, and the mystery of the Hyades. He spoke of Cassildra and Camilla, and sounded the cloudy depths of the Demhi and the lake of Hali. "The scalloped tatters of the king in yellow must hide Ythil forever," he muttered, but I do not believe Vance heard him. Then by degrees he led Vance along the ramifications of the imperial family, to Uhot and Thale, from Natalba and the Phantom of Truth to Aldanis, and then tossing aside his manuscript and notes, he began the wonderful story of the last king. Fascinated and thrilled, I watched him. He threw up his head, his long arms were stretched out in a magnificent gesture of pride and power, and his eyes blazed deep in their sockets like two emeralds. Vance listened stupefied. As for me, when at last Mr. Wilde had finished and pointing to me cried, "The cousin of the king!" my head swam with excitement. Controlling myself with superhuman effort, I explained to Vance why I alone was worthy of the crown, and why my cousin must be exiled or die. I made him understand that my cousin must never marry, even after renouncing all his claims, and how the least of all he should marry the daughter of the Marquis of Avonshire, and bring England into the question. I showed him the list of thousands of names which Mr. Wilde had drawn up. Every man whose name was there had received the yellow sign, which no living human being dared to disregard. The city, the state, the whole land were ready to rise and tremble before the pallid mask. The time had come. The people should know of the son of Hastor, and the whole world bow to the black stars which hang in the sky over Carcosa. Vance leaned on the table, his head buried in his hands. Mr. Wilde drew a rough sketch on the margin of yesterday's Herald with a bit of lead pencil. It was a plan of Hallberg's rooms. Then he wrote out the order and affixed the seal, and shaking like a palsied man, I signed my first writ of execution with my name, Hildred Rex. Mr. Wilde clambered to the floor and, unlocking the cabinet, took a long square box from the first shelf. This he brought to the table and opened. A new knife lay in the tissue paper inside, and I picked it up and handed it to Vance, along with the order and the plan of Hallberg's apartment. Then Mr. Wilde told Vance he could go, and he went, shambling like an outcast of the slums. Let me adjust my headphones here. I sat for a while watching the daylight fade behind the square tower of the Judson Memorial Church, and finally, gathering up the manuscript and notes, I took my hat and started for the door. Mr. Wilde watched me in silence. When I had stepped into the hall, I looked back. Mr. Wilde's small eyes were still fixed on me. Behind him, the shadows gathered in fading light. Then I closed the door behind me and went out to the darkening streets. I had eaten nothing since breakfast, but I was not hungry. A wretched, half-starved creature who stood looking across the street at the lethal chamber noticed me and came up to tell me a tale of misery. I gave him money. I don't know why, and he went away without thanking me. An hour later, another outcast approached and whined his story. I had a blank bit of paper in my pocket, onto which I traced the yellow sign, and I handed it to him. He looked at it stupidly for a moment, and then, with an uncertain glance at me, folded it with what seemed to me exaggerated care, and placed it in his bosom. The electric lights were sparkling among the trees, and the new moon shone in the sky above the lethal chamber. It was tiresome waiting in the square. I wandered from the Marble Arch to the artillery stables, and back again to the Lotos fountain. The flowers and grass exhaled a fragrance which troubled me. The jet of the fountain played in the moonlight, and the musical splash of falling drops reminded me of the tinkle of chained mail in Hallberg's shop. But it was not so fascinating, and the dull sparkle of the moonlight on the water brought no such sensations of exquisite pleasure, as when the sunshine played over the polished steel of a corselet on Hallberg's knee. I watched the bats starting and turning above the water plants in the fountain basin, but their rapid, jerky flight set my nerves on edge, and I went away again to walk aimlessly to and fro among the trees. The artillery stables were dark, but in the cavalry barracks the officers' windows were brilliantly lighted, and the sally port was constantly filled with troopers in fatigue, carrying straw and harness and baskets filled with tin dishes. Twice the mounted sentry at the gates was changed while I wandered up and down the asphalt walk. I looked at my watch. It was nearly time. The light in the barracks went out one by one, the barred gate was closed, and every minute or two an officer passed through in the side wicket, leaving a rattle of accoutrements and a jingle of spurs on the night air. The square had become very silent. The last homeless loiterer had been driven away by the grave-coated park policeman. The car tracks along Wooster Street were deserted. The only sound which broke the stillness was the stamping of the sentry's horse, and the ring of his saber against the saddle pommel. In the barracks, the officers' quarters were still lighted, and military servants passed and repassed before the bay windows. 12 o'clock sounded from the spire of St. Francis Xavier, and at the last stroke of the sad-toned bell, a figure passed through the wicket bedside of the portcullis, returned the salute of the sentry, and crossing the street, entered the square and advanced toward the Benedict apartment house. "Louis," I called. The man pivoted on his spurred heels and came straight toward me. "Is that you, Hildred?" "Yes, you're on time." I took his offered hand, and we strolled toward the lethal chamber. He rattled on about his wedding, and the graces of Constance, and their future prospects, calling my attention to his captain's shoulder straps, and the triple gold arabesque on his sleeve and fatigue cap. I believe I listened as much to the music of his spurs and saber as I did to his boyish babble, and at last we stood under the elms on 4th Street, corner of the square, opposite the lethal chamber. Then he laughed and asked me what I wanted with him. I motioned him to a seat on a bench under the electric light, and sat down beside him. He looked at me curiously, with that same searching glance which I hate and fear so in doctors. I felt the insult of his look, but he did not know it, and I carefully concealed my feelings. "Well, old chap," he inquired, "what can I do for you?" I drew from my pocket the manuscript and notes of the Imperial Dynasty of America, and looking him in the eye, I said, "I will tell you. On your word as a soldier, promise me to read this manuscript from beginning to end, without asking me a question. Promise me to read these notes in the same way, and promise me to listen to what I have to tell later." "I promise if you wish it," he said pleasantly. "Give me the paper, Hildred." He began to read, raising his eyebrows with a puzzled, whimsical air, which made me tremble with suppressed anger. As he advanced, his eyebrows contracted, and his lips seemed to form the word rubbish. Then he looked slightly bored, but apparently for my sake read, with an attempt at interest, which presently ceased to be an effort. He started when in the closely written pages he came to his own name, and when he came to mine he lowered the paper, and looked sharply at me for a moment. But he kept his word and resumed his reading, and I let the half-formed question die on his lips unanswered. When he came to the end and read the signature of Mr. Wilde, he folded the paper carefully and returned it to me. I handed him the notes, and he settled back, pushing the fatigue cap up on his forehead with a boyish gesture, which I remembered so well in school. I watched his face as he read, and when he finished I took the notes with the manuscript and placed them in my pocket. Then I unfurled a scroll, marked with the yellow sign. He saw the sign, but he did not seem to recognize it, and I called his attention to it somewhat sharply. "Well," he said, "I see it. What is it?" "It is the yellow sign," I said angrily. "Okay, that's it, is it?" said Louis in that that's it, is it?" said Louis in that flattering voice which Dr. Archer used to employ with me, and probably would have employed again had I not settled his affair for him. I kept my rage down and answered as steadily as possible. "Listen, you have engaged your word." "I'm listening, old chap," he replied soothingly. I began to speak very calmly. Dr. Archer, having by some means become possessed by the secret of the imperial succession, attempted to deprive me of my right, alleging that because of a fall from my horse 4 years ago I had become mentally deficient. He presumed to place me under restraint in his own house in hopes of either driving me insane or poisoning me. I have not forgotten it. I visited him last night, and the interview was final. Louis turned quite pale, but did not move. I resumed triumphantly. "There are yet 3 people to be interviewed in the interests of Mr. Wilde and myself. There are my cousin Louis, Mr. Harbrook, and his daughter Constance." Louis sprang to his feet, and I rose also, and flung the paper marked with the yellow sign to the ground. "Oh, I don't need that to tell you what I have to say," I cried with a laugh of triumph. "You must renounce the crown to me. Do you hear? To me!" Louis looked at me with a startled air, but recovering himself said kindly, "Of course I renounce the... What is it I renounce?" "The crown," I said angrily. "Of course," he answered, "I renounce it. Come, old chap. I'll walk back to your rooms with you." "Don't try any of your doctor's tricks on me," I cried, trembling with fury. "Don't act as if you think I'm insane." "What nonsense," he replied. "Come, it's getting late, Hildred." "No," I shouted. "You must listen. You cannot marry. I forbid it. Do you hear? I forbid it. You shall renounce the crown, and in reward I grant you exile. But if you refuse, you shall die." He tried to calm me, but I was roused at last, and drawing my long knife, I barred his way. Then I told him how they would find Dr. Archer in the cellar with his throat open, and I laughed in his face when I thought of Vance and his knife, and the order signed by me. "Ah, you are the king," I cried, "but I shall be king. Who are you to keep me from the empire over all the habitable earth? I was born the cousin of a king, but I shall be king!" Louis stood white and rigid before me. Suddenly a man came running up 4th Street, entered the gate of the Lethal Temple, traversed the path into the bronze doors at full speed, and plunged into the death chamber with the cry of one demented. And I laughed until I wept tears, for I had recognized Vance, and knew that Hallberg and his daughter were no longer in my way. Go, I cried to Louis. You have ceased to be a menace. You will never marry Constance now, and if you marry anyone else in your exile, I will visit you as I did my doctor last night. Mr. Wilde takes charge of you tomorrow. Then I turned and darted into South Fifth Avenue. With a cry of terror, Louis dropped his belt and saber and followed me like the wind. I heard him close behind me at the corner of Bleecker Street, and I dashed into the doorway under Holberg's sign. He cried, "Halt, or I fire!" But when he saw that I flew up the stairs leaving Holberg's shop below, he left me, and I heard him hammering and shouting at the door, as though it were possible to arouse the dead. Mr. Wilde's door was open, and I entered crying, "It's done! It's done! Let the nations rise and look upon their king!" But I could not find Mr. Wilde, so I went to the cabinet and took the splendid diadem from its case. Then I drew on the white silk robe embroidered with the yellow sign and placed the crown above my head. At last I was king. King by my right in Hastur. King because I knew the mystery of the Hyades, and my mind had sounded the depths of the lake of Hali. I was king. The first gray pencilings of dawn would raise a tempest which would shake 2 hemispheres. Then as I stood, my every nerve pitched to the highest tension, faint with the joy and splendor of my thought, without, in the dark passage, a man groaned. I seized the tallow dip and sprang to the door. The cat passed me like a demon, and the tallow dip went out, but my long knife flew swifter than she, and I heard her screech, and I knew that my knife had found her. For a moment I listened to her tumbling and thumping about in the darkness, and then when her frenzy ceased, I lighted a lamp and raised it over my head. Mr. Wilde lay on the floor with his throat torn open. At first I thought he was dead, but as I looked, a green sparkle came from his sunken eyes. His mutilated hand trembled, and then a spasm stretched his mouth from ear to ear. For a moment my terror and despair gave place to hope, but as I bent over him, his eyeballs rolled clean around in his head, and he died. Then while I stood, transfixed with rage and despair, seeing my crown, my empire, every hope and every ambition, my very life, lying prostrate there within the dead master, they came, seized me from behind, and bound me until my veins stood out like cords, and my voice failed with the paroxysms of frenzied screams. Don't think I've ever heard paroxysms before. And more than one policeman felt my sharp teeth. Then when I could no longer move, they came nearer. I saw old Holberg, and behind him my cousin Louis's ghostly face, and farther away in the corner a woman, Constance, weeping softly. "Ah! I see it now!" I shrieked. "You have seized the throne of the empire! Woe! Woe to you who are crowned with the crown of the king in yellow!" End of The Repairer of Reputations. That was fun. We got some time. Let's talk about it. I don't want to start part 2, which is called The Mask, tonight. Instead, we'll talk about The Repairer of Reputations. Because that was a pretty mile a minute ending, just as the beginning had been. A lot happened just there. It was a lot. Yeah, I agree. Um, but it ended with Mr. Castaigne being seized by the policemen and taken away, possibly, to go back to the asylum. I believe there's an editor's note that says he was returned to the asylum for the criminally insane. Or probably placed there for the first time, because I doubt that was the type of place he went after his fall. I want to talk about it, but I don't want to give too much of my understanding of it away before I hear a little bit of your all's understanding of it. Let's hear some thoughts. Let's hear your take on what we just read. Really, you can give me your take on the whole story if you want to, but especially the ending. I know what's up with this. I've probably read it 3 or 4 times, and I've read a lot of people's writing about it. But I would like to hear some fresh, untainted takes. I'm going to have to re-listen. It's a lot, and I stumbled over it pretty hard. I don't feel great about that. I imagine everybody should re-listen, probably. But you don't have to. But yeah, it's a lot. He had some stuff at the beginning. He hit his head, right? He took a fall from a horse, he said. Then he was taken to an asylum um, for the mentally deficient. And it was in there that he read The King in Yellow while he was in asylum. And then he says he was released on an acknowledgement that he had never been deficient in the first place. And that was when he met Dr. Archer, was in there. That was his caregiver in the asylum, was Dr. Archer. It sounds like just a narcissist, one who has money and power and therefore requires respect. Yeah, maybe at first blush. Um, let's talk about some of his unreliable narrator moments. And you know, I think those are pretty important to the story. Where's my one that I... Here it is. So, he talks about the gold and diamond diadem that he takes out of the time lock safe every day and admires, because it reminds him that he's going to be king one day, right? It's going to be his crown when he is eventually, um, takes the throne from Louis Castaigne and becomes Hildred Rex, right? And then he's admiring it one day in May when Louis stops by and he says, "Take off that brass crown, toddle into the study. Are you going to a masquerade?" And Louis says, "I was glad he thought the crown was made of brass and paste, yet I didn't like him any better for thinking so." And then Louis sort of plays with the crown. He tosses it up in his hands a few times and catches it, and he says, "Oh, it's dear at 50 cents. What's it for?" Obviously, it's dear at 50 cents, meaning you would be lucky to get 50 cents for it. And then, the line here is important. He watched me curiously, but did not seem to notice the sudden ceasing of the alarm. He did, however, speak of the safe as a biscuit box. So he says that he doesn't seem to think that his cousin even noticed the blaring alarm of the safe, and then he calls the safe a biscuit box. Like, he literally does not seem to notice that there's an alarm going off. Maybe there's not an alarm going off. So that's a big one. There's a big one right at the end. Let me find it. So Hildred Rex signs that execution order, basically blackmailing Vance into assassinating some people that are in his way. And he says this. Suddenly a man came running up 4th Street, entered the gate of the Lethal Temple, traversed the path to the bronze doors at full speed, and plunged into the death chamber with the cry of one demented. And I laughed until I wept tears, for I had recognized Vance and knew that Hallberg and his daughter were no longer in my way. He sent him off with a knife and an execution order, and then he says, "Oh, those people are no longer in my way." And then he laughs triumphantly at his cousin and says, "You have ceased to be a menace. You will never marry Constance now, and if you marry anyone else in your exile, I'll visit you as I did my doctor last night." And of course, importantly, 2 pages later, Hallberg and Constance literally show up in the room where Hildred is arrested. It's like they're watching him be arrested, or maybe they're not, But it would there's no reason why it couldn't be really them since they live just downstairs. And then easily easily, in my opinion, the unreliable narrator moment that, if you go back over it, tells you the whole story, is right during his conversation with Louis at the end of the part. He says, here it is. This sells it. Dr. Archer, having by some means become possessed of the secret of the imperial succession, attempted to deprive me of my right, alleging that because of a fall from my horse 4 years ago, I had become mentally deficient. He presumed to place me under restraint in his own house in hopes of either driving me insane or poisoning me. I have not forgotten it. So he literally just stood there and looked at his brother and said, they made up a conspiracy about how I'm insane to kill me and stop me from becoming king of the world. He didn't even know the Kennedys would happen. He literally just said they made up a conspiracy to stop me from being king of the world because they knew it was going to happen. They knew it was enshrouded and enshrined in the imperial destiny. He's got all those Napoleon books. So there's a lot going on here. I can give you the full explanation if it's still not totally adding up, but I think all the pieces are definitely there, and I think we've pretty much been over the stuff that you really need to get what you're supposed to get. And then we can talk about the racism. Isn't that exciting? Fuck. Didn't even know the Kennedys would happen. Come on. He died before the Kennedys happened. I think. The important parts of it, anyway. Wow, excuse me. Wow. Um, let's just talk about it. So the story of Hildred Castaigne. He takes a fall on his horse. He gets sent to an asylum where he reads The King in Yellow, which Vance and Louis both directly state is a book that potentially has the ability to instill madness in you. And then, probably at his time in the asylum, he meets Mr. Wilde, because, they both spent time in the asylum. Probably is where he met Mr. Wilde. And Mr. Wilde has got this imperial dynasty of America that he drew up. He signed it. And he's got this, like, crazy, ridiculous, basically what amounts to a fan fiction about how the Earth is going to be conquered by the dynasty of the King in Yellow, and how the King in Yellow's official royal servants are going to rule the whole of the Earth, and this is the list of the people that will be those royal servants, and like this is the line of succession. Deranged ravings. But of course, Hildred Castaigne finds that his name is on it, and he's like, okay, hold on, like you're saying that when the King in Yellow takes over the world, which the two of us believe is going to happen, because we have read The King in Yellow, and it has fucked with our minds. Like, when that happens, like, you saying that I could be king if I just exile my cousin? Like, I'll be the king of the whole world? He's like, yeah. And so they're meeting, and Hildred is very fascinated by this concept. I mean, he's going back almost every day to reread the manuscript that says he's going to be king of the world. He's got that little brass, like 50-cent crown in a biscuit box that he is convinced is a like gold and diamond jeweled diadem that's in a giant airtight safe that he tries on, and he thinks about what it's going to be like when he's king. But yeah, Mr. Wilde is telling him, you're not going to be king unless you can stop your brother from being king. So you have to exile him or kill him, and you have to do something before he's married, presumably because, in royal affairs, when you get married, the line of succession is not guaranteed to be the same as it was before. So if you have to deal with him before he gets married in order to guarantee that you're next in line. If you add another family into the mix, it could get mixed up. That's my impression of why it has to be before he's married anyway. I don't know exactly. But Mr. Wilde is working as a repairer of reputations, which is a professional blackmailer, slowly getting people to do what he says and forcing them onto his payroll and, holding information above their heads and sort of puppeting them, growing this control further and further. I think he genuinely believes that, using his repairer of reputations like influence and blackmail and, ability to tell people what to do is control, that he is going to seriously like plot with Hildred to overthrow the government and instill his theocratic King in Yellow dynasty based on this book that they read. And yeah, Hildred is convinced at this point that he is destined to be the king. He was never insane, that he's actually destined to be the king of the world, and everyone who has stood in his it told him he's insane basically has done so not because he is mentally deficient, but because they secretly know that he's destined to be king of the world, and they're doing everything in their power to stop him, including even his doctors at the asylum believe this. He believes this about them, and he says that he's killed Dr. Archer. Who knows if he actually has? Because he said that Constance and Hallbrook were dead, and that was not true. So God only knows if he actually killed Dr. Archer. And then, of course, in that last line where he sees that his cousin Louis got the attention of some policemen to subdue him and put him in asylum, he says at the end, he's like, curse the crown of the King in Yellow, curse anyone who wears the crown of the King in Yellow, curse the King in Yellow. Like, he totally just flips. He's like, no, fuck this, curse the King in Yellow, curse the King in Yellow. Kind of an unstable thing to do. But yeah, it's an unreliable narrator story. Hildred Castaigne is deeply uninvested in telling the truth, and that extends really to the whole of the story, probably all the way to the government lethal chambers, probably. And in fact, to revisit the issue that I said we would revisit, the scholars that I have read, do believe that Hildred Castaigne's rant at the beginning of the book about what happened in the 1920s, and all these different presidents and these wars that were fought, and Russia conquered all of Europe, and the Jews were evicted and the blacks were relocated. That really all of that is just complete nonsense, or that he's either that it's complete nonsense, or that he's quoting the Imperial Dynasty paper that Mr. Wilde wrote, and not really describing what the world is like. Or even maybe talking about almost like what he would do as king, which he intends to be, because he talks about how he's gonna secure the happiness of the whole entire world as king and promote peace and harmony or whatever. But definitely based on, I think the thing about the lethal chambers is verified by other stories in the book, but most of that stuff is not. The whole creepy dystopian future of the 1920s that Hildred describes at the beginning of the book is definitely a horror thing. It's clear to me that Chambers knew that what he was describing was a scary world, and he did that on purpose. But whether he did that for the purpose of establishing a scary world for the characters to live in, or to later give the reveal that Hildred Castaigne is an unstable and unreliable person, and to have you go back and doubt the things that he said, that's not That's not something that we ever got confirmation on. I don't think he's telling the truth. I mean, he's got all those Napoleon books, and he's so concerned with his future as king. I think he's inventing his own history, probably. But yeah, it's definitely all designed to evoke a world that you wouldn't want to live in. But having the character be very like, oh, it's wonderful, like there's peace and harmony now, while describing all these terrible things, like, oh yeah, there's peace and harmony. Russia has conquered all of Europe. We have evicted all of the foreign-born Jewish people and all of the black people from our country. We have genocided the Native Americans. All bigotry has been eliminated. Like, it's definitely like a thing that he was doing on purpose. It was not Robert W. Chambers just being like, here's what I think the world should be like. So like, we can at least put that anxiety to rest. Um, but yeah, that was the first part of The King in Yellow, and it is either the longest or the second longest, so I suspect we will be done with this book in a month's time. Possibly even less than that, honestly. It might only take us 3 sessions to finish this book, because The Mask and Court of the Dragon are both really short. We might be able to knock them both out in a single night. And then The Yellow Sign is probably going to take one good session, I would say. And then we'll be done with it. We're moving on. How exciting is that? But yeah, re-listening is comes pretty highly recommended. The King in Yellow is not a very easily understood book when you're distracted. I think it's a easy to understand book when you're fully invested into doing so, but with the nature of listening, I totally understand. But hopefully we'll be able to discuss more about it. Hopefully everybody will get a chance to go back over it, and then they'll really be able to give their thoughts. Uh, I think most importantly, probably the most important thing, if I was re-listening and I was trying to figure out like what are the details that I'm interested in knowing, to me the most important thing would be getting a picture of what the hell the King in Yellow is. Like the book is called The King in Yellow. Like what the fuck is the King in Yellow? It's been described as like 3 different things in this book alone. It's like it's a person, it's a book, it's a plan for America. Like what the fuck is the King in Yellow? That's going to be the central theme connecting all 4 of these stories. Obviously, is the presence of the King in Yellow. So that might be something that I would focus on when I was trying to wrap my head around what we read today. That's the most important thing. I mean, it was the driving force behind the whole story was the influence of the King in Yellow over the characters. The book, the person, the concept, the plan for America, all the King in Yellow things. He describes a lot of things that are from the King in Yellow. He describes a lot of he describes things that he read in the book. He talks about locations a lot, like Carcosa and the Hyades and what's the other one? Aldebaran and Hastur. The Hyades being a lake, Aldebaran and Hastur being cities, and Carcosa seeming to be maybe a planet or like a nation. You know, he mentions all these different things. He mentions the Phantom of Truth, Yathil, the Pallid Mask, all this shit that he's all quoting from the book. So those might be things to zero in on if it were me. Since the stuff that we're going to be reading next week is also going to be about the King in Yellow, all of the little bits of King in Yellow lore that can be extracted from this story, like that's what you want. But that picks it up for today. So, I'm going to go ahead and cut off the recording in a minute. As a reminder, especially for this story, even more so than the last one we read, as a reminder, if you have like questions or theories that you want my opinion on, like, or you're confused at all with what we read or what it meant or what I was trying to say at one point, like, drop that shit. You know, this is a no man left behind book group in terms of, keeping track of what's happening. No man left behind is my policy. So remember that. And if you are just listening to this now and you have questions you want to put in the group, like, drop them, DM them to me, whatever you want to do. We can talk about it. I love to talk about this book. I've read it probably 2 or 3 times all the way through, including the giant book of unrelated stories that it was originally packaged with. Some of which, again, are quite entertaining, but none of which are at all relevant. All right. Well, thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now.